I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're sitting quietly after a long day of caring for children who aren't yours, folding their clothes while your own heart aches for recognition. Or perhaps you're wiping tears from eyes that have seen too much kindness go unnoticed, too much love given freely only to be forgotten. Maybe you're the woman who taught someone to walk, to speak their first words, to tie their shoes, yet you were never invited to their graduation. It doesn't matter what time it is where you are, or how tired your hands feel tonight. This story is for you. This is the story of Clara Martinez, a woman from Birmingham, Alabama, who came to Manhattan with nothing but hope in her suitcase and a photograph of the daughter she lost. This is about how she became the invisible mother to the Whitman children, how she loved them with a fierce tenderness that money could never buy, and how she nearly lost everything when a diamond necklace disappeared from their Fifth Avenue penthouse. But most of all, this is about how sometimes the smallest voice in a house can speak the loudest truth, and how love, real, unwavering love, always finds its way back home. Clara's hands moved through the morning routine like water finding its path. The sound of her footsteps on the marble floors was softer than whispers, a practiced silence she'd perfected over 9 years of early mornings in the Whitman penthouse. The coffee machine hummed to life at exactly 6:15, the rich aroma filling the kitchen, while Fifth Avenue still slept beneath a blanket of pre-dawn quiet. She'd learned to love these moments, the solitude, the peace before the storm of another day caring for Emily and Max Whitman, children who had never known what it meant to tie their own shoes or comfort themselves after a nightmare. Clara's reflection caught in the window overlooking Central Park, and for just a moment she allowed herself to remember the woman she'd been before the accident that took her daughter Sophia, before the foreclosure that stripped away her small house in Birmingham, before she'd packed everything that mattered into 2 suitcases and bought a one-way Greyhound ticket to New York City, chasing a job advertisement that promised competitive salary for experienced childcare professional. That was 9 years ago, when her hair was still completely black instead of streaked with silver, when her hands weren't marked by countless hours of cooking, cleaning, and endless gentle touches. She'd arrived at the Whitman residence on a cold October morning, her Alabama accent thick with nervousness as she stood in the marble foyer, looking up at ceilings so high they seemed to touch heaven itself. Andrew Whitman had interviewed her with the detached efficiency of a man accustomed to hiring and firing without emotional investment. His wealth was apparent in every detail, from the crystal chandelier that cost more than Clara's entire life savings to the Persian rugs that muffled their conversation. He spoke about stock portfolios and real estate ventures with casual indifference, mentioning that his net worth had recently crossed the billion-dollar threshold thanks to strategic investments in both traditional markets and emerging cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. But when little Emily, then only 2 years old, had wandered into the room wearing mismatched socks and carrying a stuffed elephant, Clara had knelt to her level instinctively, and something in the child's eyes had recognized something in hers. The first months had been a delicate dance of boundaries and expectations. Mrs. Whitman, Andrew's wife Margaret, had made the rules crystal clear during Clara's second week. "You must understand, Clara, that while we appreciate your dedication to the children, you are an employee. The children have family, and you are not family. Don't encourage them to become too attached, and please don't overstep your role." The words had stung worse than any physical blow, but Clara had nodded with the dignity she'd inherited from her grandmother, a woman who had worked in white families' homes throughout the segregated South and had taught Clara that strength sometimes looked like silence. Yet how could Clara not become attached when Emily ran to her arms after skinning her knee, when Max whispered his fears about monsters under the bed during thunderstorms, when both children called for her in the middle of the night instead of their parents? The Whitmans lived their lives in separate orbits. Andrew buried in business calls and board meetings, Margaret flitting between charity galas and spa appointments, while the children existed in a world where love came from Clara's patient hands and gentle songs. Clara watched from the kitchen doorway as Andrew ate breakfast while scrolling through financial reports, his coffee growing cold while he calculated returns on investment properties scattered across Manhattan. He spoke to his children like board members, asking about their performance in school with the same tone he might use to inquire about quarterly earnings. When Emily showed him a drawing she'd made, he glanced at it for exactly 3 seconds before returning to his phone. But Clara saw the way Emily's face fell, how her small shoulders curved inward with disappointment. Later, Clara would find that same drawing taped to the refrigerator in the staff kitchen, where she'd hang every piece of artwork, every proud moment that the parents missed. The children began to migrate toward Clara's presence like flowers turning toward sunlight. They would sit at the kitchen table while she prepared their meals, chattering about their days, their dreams, their fears. Emily confessed that she wanted to be a teacher like Miss Rodriguez at school, and Max admitted he was afraid of diving and swimming lessons. Clara listened with the full attention their parents never offered, celebrating their victories and soothing their disappointments with homemade cookies and warm embraces that smelled of vanilla and unconditional acceptance. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday in November, when 3-year-old Max spiked a fever that climbed toward dangerous territory. Margaret was in the Hamptons for a weekend retreat, and Andrew was locked in emergency meetings about a collapsing business deal in Dubai. Clara found Max burning up in his small bed, his cheeks flushed scarlet and his breathing rapid and shallow. Without hesitation, she gathered him in her arms, called the pediatrician, and spent the next 18 hours alternating between cool compresses and gentle songs, her own body exhausted, but her vigilance unwavering. She dozed fitfully in the rocking chair beside his bed, waking every few minutes to check his temperature, to offer sips of water, to whisper reassurances in both English and Spanish, the lullabies her own mother had sung when Clara was small and scared. When Max's fever finally broke near dawn, he opened his heavy eyes and reached for her hand. "Clara," he whispered, his voice hoarse but clear, "I love you." The words hit her like a benediction and a heartbreak all at once. Andrew had returned home that morning to find his son recovering peacefully, Clara still in the rocking chair with Max's small hand in hers. For the first time since she'd known him, something flickered in Andrew's eyes, not quite gratitude, but perhaps the beginning of recognition. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching this woman who had given up her sleep, her comfort, her own needs to care for his child with the devotion of a mother. "The doctor said his fever could have been serious," Clara said quietly, not looking for praise but simply reporting what had happened. Andrew nodded slowly, and Clara caught a glimpse of something she'd never seen before: vulnerability. For just an instant, the billionaire facade cracked, and she saw a man who was terrified of failing his children but didn't know how to love them. "Thank you," he said. And though the words were simple, Clara could hear the weight they carried. It wasn't enough to change everything, but it was something. A small seed of acknowledgement in soil that had been barren for too long. On a quiet Sunday evening, when the children were asleep and the penthouse was wrapped in the kind of silence that only wealth could buy, Clara found herself sharing the kitchen table with Andrew for the first time. He'd come down for late-night coffee and discovered her there, mending one of Emily's school sweaters by the soft light of the pendant lamp. The scene was so domestic, so far removed from boardrooms and business deals, that he'd hesitated before pouring himself a cup and sitting across from her. "You don't have to do that," he said, nodding toward the sweater. "We can buy her new ones." Clara continued her careful stitches, her voice gentle but firm. "This one is her favorite. She told me it makes her feel brave." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the distant hum of the city and the soft whisper of thread through fabric. Then, without planning to, Clara began to speak. She told him about Sophia, her daughter who had lived for only 6 precious years before leukemia took her. She spoke of holding tiny hands in hospital rooms, of reading bedtime stories to a child who grew thinner and more fragile with each passing day. Of the morning she woke up, and Sophia didn't. Her voice remained steady, but tears fell softly onto the yellow sweater as she worked. I came to New York because I couldn't stay in that house anymore, Clara said. Every room held her echo. I thought maybe if I could love other children, if I could keep them safe and warm and happy, maybe Sophia's love would live on somehow. Andrew listened without interrupting, his coffee growing cold as he watched this woman reveal the depths of her heart. He'd never heard anyone speak with such raw honesty about loss, about love that transcends death. In his world, vulnerability was weakness, emotion was inefficiency. But sitting in his kitchen at midnight, listening to Clara's story, he began to understand something he'd never learned in all his years of accumulating wealth, that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought, traded, or invested. They could only be given freely, with no guarantee of return. "The children are lucky to have you," he said finally, and Clara looked up to see something in his eyes she'd never noticed before, the beginning of respect. "I'm lucky to have them," she replied. "They saved me as much as I've tried to save them." The morning everything changed began like any other, with Clara's gentle knock on Emily's bedroom door and the familiar routine of coaxing a sleepy 8-year-old out of warm blankets. Emily had grown into a thoughtful child, wise beyond her years in the way that children often become when they're raised more by staff than parents. She would sit at her vanity table each morning while Clara brushed her long brown hair, chattering about school friends and weekend plans, her reflection in the mirror, a younger version of the mother who was always too busy for such moments. "Clara," Emily said that Tuesday morning, "why doesn't Daddy hug us like you do?" The question hung in the air like morning mist, heavy with innocence and longing. Clara continued brushing, her strokes steady and soothing. "Your daddy loves you very much, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups show love in different ways. But you show love the right way," Emily said with the absolute certainty of childhood. "You make everything feel safe." Clara's heart squeezed tight, because she knew that despite 9 years of devotion, despite being the one who packed lunches and attended parent-teacher conferences when Andrew was traveling, despite being the arms that carried these children through nightmares and celebrations alike, she was still considered just the help in the eyes of everyone who mattered. The day unraveled slowly, like a sweater catching on a nail. Margaret had returned from her latest charity circuit, full of stories about fundraising galas and social obligations that required her attention. She swept through the penthouse like a well-dressed hurricane, leaving instructions and criticisms in her wake. The children, unused to their mother's sudden presence and demands, became clingy and restless. Max, now 5 and usually well-behaved, melted into tears when Margaret tried to brush his hair too roughly. Emily retreated to her room, overwhelmed by the sudden disruption to their peaceful routine. It was during this chaos that Margaret discovered her grandmother's diamond necklace was missing from her jewelry box. The piece was worth over $200,000, a family heirloom that had been passed down through 3 generations of Whitman women. The accusation came swift and sharp as a blade. "Someone has taken my necklace," Margaret announced, her voice carrying the cold authority of someone who had never doubted her own importance. Her eyes swept the room and landed on Clara with unmistakable suspicion. "When did you last clean my bedroom?" The question felt like a slap. Clara straightened her shoulders, meeting Margaret's gaze with quiet dignity. "I cleaned your room yesterday morning, Mrs. Whitman, the same time I always do." But suspicion, once planted, grew like poison ivy. Margaret's friends were called, whispering conversations took place behind closed doors, and by evening the assumption had hardened into certainty in their minds. The help had stolen from them. It was an old story, as predictable as it was heartbreaking. Andrew's study felt like a courtroom when Clara was summoned there the next morning. He sat behind his mahogany desk, looking every inch the billionaire businessman who had built his fortune through ruthless efficiency and quick decisions. Margaret stood beside him, her arms crossed, her face set in lines of aristocratic indignation. Clara entered with her head high, her hands steady despite the trembling in her chest. "Clara," Andrew began, his voice carrying none of the warmth from their midnight conversation just weeks before. "We need to discuss the missing necklace." The words that followed fell like hammers on her heart, accusations disguised as questions, implications wrapped in legal language, the suggestion that perhaps she'd been struggling financially, that perhaps the temptation had been too great, that perhaps she should confess now and save everyone the unpleasantness of involving the police. Clara stood in that opulent room, surrounded by artwork worth more than she'd earned in her entire lifetime, and felt the walls of her carefully built life crumbling around her. "Mr. Whitman," she said, her voice steady despite the earthquake in her soul, "I have never taken anything that didn't belong to me. I have cared for your children, your home, your family for 9 years. I would never betray that trust." But trust, she realized, had never truly existed. She had been useful, efficient, convenient, but never truly trusted. The decision was swift and brutal. Clara was given 2 hours to pack her belongings and leave the premises. No severance pay beyond her final week's wages, no letter of recommendation, no acknowledgement of 9 years of devotion that had held their family together. Security cameras would be reviewed, they said. The police might be called. The unspoken threat hung in the air like smoke. Clara climbed the narrow stairs to her small room in the staff quarters for the last time, her legs heavy as lead. She packed her few possessions methodically: photographs, a few books, the watch Emily had given her for Christmas, the drawing Max had made of them having a tea party. Each item felt precious now, artifacts of a life she was losing, not through any fault of her own, but because suspicion was easier than truth, because blame was simpler than trust. As she folded her clothes, Clara could hear Emily crying in her bedroom next door. The child had pressed her ear to the wall that connected their rooms, a habit Clara had never discouraged because she knew Emily found comfort in her presence, even through barriers. Now that connection felt like a knife twisting in her heart. The goodbye was devastating in its brevity. Margaret remained in her room, too proud or too ashamed to face the woman she was destroying. Andrew waited in the foyer, checking his watch as if Clara's exile was just another appointment to be managed efficiently. The children appeared at the top of the grand staircase, Emily still in her school uniform, Max clutching his stuffed elephant like an anchor. "Where is Clara going?" Emily asked, her voice small and confused. "Why does she have suitcases?" Andrew's explanation was crisp, bloodless. Clara had to go away for a while. They would find someone new to take care of things. The children would be fine. But Emily was 8 years old and possessed the brutal honesty of childhood. She ran down the stairs on bare feet, throwing her arms around Clara's waist with desperate strength. "You can't leave us," she sobbed. "You're supposed to stay forever. You promised you'd help me learn to braid hair like yours." Clara knelt to Emily's level, her own tears falling freely now. She cupped the child's face in her weathered hands, memorizing the freckles across her nose, the curve of her cheeks, the trust that still shone in her brown eyes despite everything falling apart around them. "Baby girl," Clara whispered. "Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that don't make sense to children, but I want you to remember something, okay? Love doesn't disappear just because people go away. Every time you're brave, every time you're kind, every time you help someone who's sad, that's my love living in your heart." Max had crept down the stairs too, and Clara pulled him into their embrace, breathing in the scent of his strawberry shampoo one last time. "Take care of each other," she told them, "and remember that I love you both more than all the stars in the sky." Andrew cleared his throat impatiently. The taxi was waiting. Clara gathered her dignity around her like armor, lifting her suitcases and walking toward the door that had welcomed her every morning for 9 years. At the threshold, she turned back once. Emily was pressed against the banister, her face streaked with tears while Max clung to his sister's hand. The sight of them, abandoned by their departing guardian, ignored by their present parents, nearly broke Clara's resolve entirely. But she had learned long ago that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away with grace, even when your heart is shattering. The elevator descended through floors of luxury toward street level, carrying Clara away from the only family she'd known since losing Sophia. When she emerged onto Fifth Avenue, the autumn air hit her face like a slap of reality. She had $67 in her wallet, no references for future employment, and nowhere to go except a friend's apartment in Queens. A woman she'd met at church who cleaned offices at night and had offered her couch if things ever got desperate. Clara had never imagined things would get this desperate. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of job applications and rejection letters. Clara had moved into Maria's one-bedroom apartment in Elmhurst, Queens, sleeping on a pull-out couch and contributing what little she could to rent and groceries. Maria worked as a night janitor for a commercial cleaning company, and she'd gotten Clara a few shifts cleaning office buildings in Manhattan, the same gleaming towers where men like Andrew Whitman made their millions trading on international markets and cryptocurrency investments. There was a cruel irony in cleaning the offices of the wealthy while being suspected of stealing from them. Clara scrubbed conference room tables where billion-dollar deals were negotiated, emptied trash cans filled with discarded financial reports showing profits that could feed whole neighborhoods, and vacuumed carpets in corner offices with views of Central Park, the same park she used to take Emily and Max to feed the ducks. Some nights, as she worked alone in those sterile spaces, Clara would catch glimpses of her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows and barely recognize herself. The woman looking back seemed older, worn down by injustice and heartbreak. Meanwhile, the penthouse on Fifth Avenue grew quieter with each passing day. The new nanny Margaret hired lasted exactly 1 week before quitting, overwhelmed by Max's tantrums and Emily's sullen withdrawal. The second lasted 3 days. The third never showed up for her second shift. Emily had stopped eating breakfast, claiming her stomach hurt every morning. Max started wetting the bed again, something he hadn't done since he was 3. Both children asked constantly when Clara was coming back, and both were told firmly to stop asking such questions. Andrew found himself noticing details he'd never paid attention to before. The coffee didn't taste the same when he made it himself. The children's schedules fell into chaos when Margaret tried to manage them alone. School called frequently about Emily's changed behavior, her sudden reluctance to participate in class discussions, her tendency to sit alone during lunch periods. Most troubling of all, Andrew discovered how much of his children's emotional world had been invisible to him. He'd never realized that Clara knew Emily was afraid of thunderstorms, that she would slip into the child's room during storms to hum softly until the fear passed. He'd never known that Max had nightmares about being lost in crowded places, or that Clara had created a special bedtime ritual involving a flashlight and shadow puppets to chase away his fears. These discoveries came to him in fragments, through teachers' comments, through overheard conversations between the children, through the simple fact that his home had become unrecognizable in Clara's absence. 3 months later, the truth revealed itself in the way truth often does, accidentally, quietly, without fanfare. Emily was helping her mother organize jewelry for an insurance appraisal when she moved a small dress box on Margaret's dressing room shelf. The diamond necklace tumbled out, wrapped in tissue paper, exactly where Margaret had stored it herself after the charity gala, and then forgotten in her rush to pack for the Hamptons. The silence in that dressing room stretched like a held breath. Emily stared at the necklace, her 8-year-old mind processing what this discovery meant. Margaret stared too, her face cycling through expressions of shock, realization, and something that might have been shame if she'd allowed it to surface fully. "I must have put it there for safekeeping," Margaret said quickly, as if saying the words could rewrite history. But Emily's moral compass, sharpened by years of Clara's patient teachings about right and wrong, would not allow this erasure of justice. "You said Clara stole it," Emily said, her voice steady with the terrible clarity of childhood truth-telling. "You made her go away because you said she was a thief, but she didn't take anything. She never takes anything except care of us." The confrontation that followed between mother and daughter was brief but seismic. Emily demanded Clara's immediate return, her young voice carrying an authority that Margaret had never heard before. When Margaret tried to explain that things were complicated, that they couldn't simply undo what had been done, Emily's response cut like a clean blade. Clara always said that when you hurt someone, you have to make it right. She said that's what good people do. That evening, Andrew found Emily in her room, sitting at her child-sized desk, carefully writing with her best penmanship. She was composing a letter to Clara, not a child's simple note, but a thoughtful message that apologized for the adults who had failed both of them, that promised to find a way to bring Clara home, that declared with fierce certainty that Clara was the most important person in their family, even if the grown-ups had forgotten that truth. Andrew read the letter over his daughter's shoulder, and with each word, the fortress he'd built around his emotions crumbled a little more. He saw himself through Emily's eyes, a father who had been so focused on accumulating wealth that he'd failed to recognize the person who had been raising his children with wisdom, patience, and unconditional love. That night, for the first time in months, Andrew couldn't sleep. He walked through his penthouse, noting all the spaces Clara had touched with her care. The kitchen where she'd made countless meals with love instead of obligation. The playroom where she'd spent hours building block cities and hosting tea parties. The bedrooms where she'd sung lullabies and chased away monsters. Every corner held evidence of devotion that had been invisible to him until it was gone. The search for Clara began with phone calls that led nowhere. The employment agency that had originally connected her with the Whitmans had no current address. Her old apartment in Birmingham had been sold years ago. The church where she'd mentioned attending had no record of a forwarding address. For a man accustomed to having any problem solved with sufficient money and influence, Andrew discovered there were some things, some people, who couldn't be found through traditional channels. It was Maria, Clara's friend from Queens, who finally answered a call at the church where both women attended Spanish language services. Maria's voice was cautious, protective, when Andrew explained who he was and why he was calling. "Clara is a good woman," Maria said in careful English. "She don't deserve what happened to her. Why you want to find her now?" Andrew's explanation was halting, unpracticed. He wasn't used to admitting mistakes, to laying bare his failures as a father and employer. But something in Maria's voice, the fierce loyalty of one working woman protecting another, demanded honesty. "We found the necklace," he said finally. "Clara never took it. We were wrong. The children, my children, miss her terribly. We need to make this right." The silence stretched long enough that Andrew wondered if Maria had hung up. Then, softly, "She working at daycare center on Northern Boulevard. But Senor Whitman, Clara's heart been broken bad. She don't trust easy now. You're gonna have to prove you mean what you say." Northern Boulevard in Queens was a world away from Fifth Avenue, not just in miles, but in every way that mattered. The Sunshine Daycare Center occupied a converted house with peeling paint and a small playground behind a chain-link fence. Children's artwork covered every window. Crayon drawings of families and sunshine that spoke of joy found in simple things. Andrew parked his BMW between a dented minivan and a compact car held together with prayer and determination, feeling more out of place than he'd ever felt in any international boardroom. Through the window, he could see Clara sitting on the floor with a circle of toddlers, reading from a picture book with the same gentle attention she'd given Emily and Max. Her hair was shorter now, more gray than black, and she wore a simple cardigan that had seen better days. But her smile was the same, warm, patient, genuine. The children around her leaned in like flowers seeking sunlight, and Andrew understood with sudden clarity what he'd lost when he'd let suspicion override wisdom, what his own children had been mourning all these months. The reunion took place in a small coffee shop 3 blocks from the daycare center, a modest place with mismatched chairs and the comfortable shabbiness of a neighborhood institution. Clara had agreed to meet after her shift ended, though her initial response to Andrew's request had been coolly professional. She arrived with the quiet dignity he remembered, taking a seat across from him with her hands folded carefully on the scratched table surface. The apology Andrew had rehearsed during sleepless nights dissolved in his throat when faced with the reality of Clara's presence. How do you apologize for destroying someone's life based on assumptions? How do you ask forgiveness for 9 years of taking someone for granted, then throwing them away the moment suspicion arose? "Clara," he began, then stopped. overwhelmed by the inadequacy of any words he might say. She waited with the patience she'd shown during countless bedtime stories, countless scraped knee incidents, countless moments when his children had needed her steady presence more than they'd needed his money. "We found the necklace," he said finally. "Margaret had put it away herself, then forgotten. You never took anything. We were wrong. I was wrong." Clara's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Not surprise exactly, but perhaps sad vindication. "I know," she said quietly. "I knew you'd find it eventually. Truth has a way of surfacing, even when people don't want to see it." The simplicity of her response, the lack of anger or moral victory, humbled Andrew more than any accusation could have. "The children miss you," he continued, "Emily especially. She's been different since you left, sadder, more withdrawn. She wrote you a letter." He slid the envelope across the table, Emily's careful handwriting spelling out Clara's name in purple ink adorned with small hearts. Clara took the letter but didn't open it immediately, her fingers tracing the child's writing with the tenderness of someone handling something precious. "How is Max?" she asked. "Still having nightmares?" The fact that she thought of the children's well-being before her own vindication told Andrew everything he needed to know about her character, everything he'd been too blind to see during 9 years of taking her dedication for granted. "He wets the bed again," Andrew admitted. "They both ask for you constantly. Emily hasn't eaten a proper breakfast since you left. She says the eggs don't taste right when anyone else makes them." Clara's composure cracked slightly at this news, her love for those children written clearly across her features. But when she spoke, her voice remained steady. "Children adapt," she said. "They'll find new routines, new comfort. That's what children do." But Andrew could see that Clara's own heart hadn't adapted, that she carried the loss of Emily and Max like a physical wound. The conversation that followed was careful, measured, both adults dancing around the enormous hurt that lay between them. Clara asked about the children's schoolwork, their friends, their growth. Andrew found himself describing details he'd never noticed before Clara's absence. Emily's advanced reading level, Max's fascination with building things, the way both children had begun hiding in their rooms more often, creating small sanctuaries away from the emotional emptiness of their home. "I realize now," Andrew said slowly, "that you weren't just caring for them. You were raising them in ways I never understood. You were their emotional foundation, their security, their—" He stopped, struggling for words that could encompass the magnitude of what Clara had meant to his family. "Their mother," Clara finished softly. "Not in birth, but in all the ways that matter day to day. I know exactly what I was to them, Mr. Whitman. The question is whether you know what you lost when you decided I was dispensable." The words weren't spoken with anger, but with a sadness so profound it made Andrew's chest ache. He saw himself through her eyes, a man who had possessed something invaluable and had discarded it based on the flimsiest of suspicions, who had valued his wife's heirloom jewelry more than the person who had made his house a home. "Come back," he said simply. "Please, name your salary, name your terms, name anything you want. The children need you. I need you to come back." Clara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on Emily's letter still unopened in her hands. When she finally looked up, her expression was kind but resolute. "Mr. Whitman, I've started something good here at the daycare. These children need me too. Children whose parents work night shifts and can't afford fancy nannies. Children who speak Spanish and English and sometimes feel lost between both worlds. I can't just abandon them because circumstances have changed." "Then let me help," Andrew said quickly. "Let me fund the daycare, expand the programs, hire more staff so you can still work there and come back to us part-time. Money isn't the issue here." Clara smiled, but it was tinged with melancholy. "Money was never the issue, Mr. Whitman. The issue was trust. The issue was respect. The issue was being seen as family when times were good and thrown away when times got difficult." Her words hit like stones thrown into still water, ripples of truth spreading outward to encompass years of relationship built on an unequal foundation. Andrew realized he was asking Clara to return to a situation where she would always be vulnerable, always at the mercy of suspicions and accusations, always loving people who might never truly love her back. The transformation of Andrew Whitman didn't happen overnight, but it began in that coffee shop in Queens, in the presence of a woman whose grace under fire revealed his own failures as clearly as if she'd held up a mirror to his soul. Over the following weeks, he found himself thinking about Clara's words, about the difference between employment and family, about what it meant to build trust rather than simply expect loyalty. He began spending more time with Emily and Max, trying to fill the Clara-shaped hole in their daily routine and discovering how vast that hole truly was. He learned that Emily liked her eggs scrambled with cheese, not butter, that Max needed exactly 3 bedtime stories and a glass of water with ice before he could sleep peacefully, that both children craved physical affection, hugs that lasted more than 3 seconds, forehead kisses that lingered, hands held during walks in the park. These were things Clara had known instinctively, things that had made his children feel secure and loved in ways his financial provisions never could. The guilt was overwhelming sometimes, the realization that he'd spent 9 years providing for his children's physical needs while being utterly ignorant of their emotional ones. Margaret, meanwhile, had become increasingly uncomfortable with the discovery of the necklace and its implications. She'd suggested quietly that perhaps they should simply increase Clara's final severance check and move on, but Andrew could see this suggestion for what it was, an attempt to buy absolution rather than face the consequences of her actions. "We destroyed that woman's reputation and livelihood based on an assumption," Andrew said during one of their increasingly tense conversations. "We owe her more than money. We owe her acknowledgement of the wrong we did, and we owe those children the chance to have her back in their lives. But the question of how to make genuine amends to someone whose life you've shattered remained complex." Clara had found stability at the daycare center, respect among her colleagues, affection from the children she cared for. She'd rebuilt her life from the ashes of their accusations, and Andrew began to understand that asking her to return might be asking her to risk everything she'd carefully reconstructed. The solution, when it came to him, felt both obvious and revolutionary. If Clara couldn't come back to their world, perhaps they needed to meet her in hers, to prove through actions rather than words that they understood what they'd lost and what she was worth. 6 months after their coffee shop conversation, Andrew made an announcement that surprised everyone who knew him. The Andrew Whitman Foundation would be donating $2 million to expand the Sunshine Daycare Center, creating a model facility that could serve twice as many children while providing comprehensive programs in early childhood education. But more than that, he would be personally involved in the project, serving on the board, attending community meetings, learning about the needs of working families who couldn't afford private child care. The press release mentioned Clara Martinez by name, describing her as an exceptional educator whose vision for community-based childcare serves as inspiration for this initiative. It was public acknowledgement of her value, public restoration of her reputation, public apology delivered through action rather than empty words. Emily and Max were consulted about the project, their excitement genuine when they learned they would be helping other children have access to the kind of care Clara provided. Emily suggested a library corner where children could read stories together. Max insisted on a building corner with blocks and Legos, remembering how Clara had always encouraged his construction projects, even when they took over half the living room. The groundbreaking ceremony took place on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Clara had been forced to leave the penthouse. Local politicians spoke about the importance of community investment. Childhood development experts praised the innovative approach to early education funding. But the moment that mattered most came when Clara stepped to the microphone to address the small crowd that had gathered. She wore a simple blue dress and spoke without notes, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled group. "When I first came to New York," she said, I thought success meant finding one family to care for, earning enough money to send some home to Alabama, maybe saving enough to have my own apartment someday. I never imagined I would be standing here, speaking about a program that will help hundreds of families in our community. She paused, her gaze finding Andrew and the children in the crowd. Emily was holding Andrew's hand tightly, her face glowing with pride. Max was bouncing slightly on his toes, barely containing his excitement. I've learned that family isn't just blood, isn't just legal documents, isn't just shared addresses, Clara continued. Family is choice. Family is commitment. Family is showing up day after day, especially when things get difficult. Today, we're creating space for more families to form, for more children to feel safe and loved while their parents work hard to build better lives. When the speeches ended and the golden shovels had broken ground, Andrew found himself walking beside Clara toward the small playground, where a group of children were already testing the new equipment. Emily and Max had immediately joined a game of tag, their laughter mixing with shouts in English and Spanish from children whose parents worked double shifts to provide for them, children who would benefit from the expanded programs Clara now directed. "Thank you," Clara said quietly, watching Emily help a younger child reach the monkey bars. "Not just for the money, though. That will change a lot of lives. Thank you for seeing me, really seeing me, not just as someone who worked for you, but as someone who loved your children." Andrew felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with emotions he wasn't used to expressing. "Thank you for loving them when I didn't know how to," he replied. "Thank you for being their real parent during the years when I was too focused on everything else to notice what mattered." They stood in comfortable silence. Two adults who had learned hard lessons about the difference between proximity and presence, between providing and nurturing. Max ran over, grass stains on his knees and joy written across his face. "Clara, come push me on the swing. Push me really high like you used to." Clara looked at Andrew as if asking permission, an old habit from years of navigating boundaries between employer and employee. But Andrew smiled and gestured toward the swings. "Go ahead. You don't need to ask." As Clara walked away, her hand in Max's, Andrew felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't experienced since childhood, the deep contentment that comes from knowing you've done the right thing, even if it took too long to figure out what the right thing was. Emily appeared at his elbow, leaning against his side in the casual way she'd learned from watching other children with their parents. "Daddy," she said, "are we Clara's family now? Like, her real family?" Andrew considered the question seriously, understanding its importance to his daughter's sense of security and belonging. "What do you think, sweetheart? What makes someone real family?" "Taking care of each other," Emily said without hesitation. "Being there when people are scared or sick or sad. Making sure everyone has enough food and enough hugs. Forgiving people when they mess up," she added, with the wisdom of someone who had lived through adult failures and survived them. "Then yes," Andrew said, pulling her closer. "We're Clara's family and she's ours, the real kind." 2 years later, the Whitman family had created new traditions that honored both their past and their present. Sunday dinners now took place in the community room of the expanded Sunshine Daycare Center, with Clara cooking for Andrew, Margaret, Emily, Max, and whoever else needed a meal and some company that week. Margaret had initially resisted these gatherings, uncomfortable with the informality and the mix of social classes around the dinner table. But watching Emily teach origami to the daughter of a Dominican cleaning lady, seeing Max share soccer tips with a boy whose father worked construction, she began to understand what Clara had known all along, that children learn empathy through exposure to different kinds of families, different kinds of struggles, different kinds of love. The financial success of the daycare center had exceeded everyone's expectations, leading to a second location in the Bronx and plans for a third in Brooklyn. Clara had become something of a celebrity in early childhood education circles, speaking at conferences and consulting with other programs. But she still spent her mornings reading to circles of preschoolers, still knew every child's favorite snack and preferred nap position, still had paint under her fingernails from afternoon art projects. Emily, now 10, had developed a fierce pride in Clara's work and a clear understanding of social justice that impressed her teachers and sometimes concerned her more conservative relatives. She would correct adults who referred to Clara as your old nanny by saying firmly, "Clara is the director of the Sunshine Daycare Centers, and she's my family." Max, 7, had appointed himself Clara's official assistant during weekend visits to the center, helping distribute snacks and organize toys with the same serious attention to detail that Andrew brought to business meetings. One evening, as Andrew was tucking Max into bed, his son asked the kind of question that only children feel free to ask. "Daddy, why did you fire Clara that time when we were little?" Andrew had been dreading this question while simultaneously knowing it was inevitable. Max's memories were fragmentary but persistent. He remembered Clara's tears, the suitcases, the terrible wrongness of their house without her presence. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that sometimes adults make decisions based on fear rather than fact? Suspicion rather than trust? "I made a mistake," Andrew said simply. "A big, hurtful mistake, because I didn't think carefully enough and I didn't listen well enough. Sometimes grown-ups mess up just like kids do, except our mistakes can hurt people more because we have more power." "But you fixed it," Max said with the confidence of someone whose world had ultimately been made right. "You brought Clara back, and now she has the big daycare and everyone knows she's the best." "We fixed it together," Andrew corrected gently. "Clara forgave us even though she didn't have to. She chose to let us be her family again, even after we hurt her. That's what forgiveness looks like. It's not pretending the hurt didn't happen. It's choosing to move forward together anyway." These conversations with his children had taught Andrew more about grace and redemption than any business school case study ever could. Emily and Max had internalized lessons about justice, forgiveness, and family loyalty that would shape their characters for life. They'd learned that love requires both feeling and action, that trust can be rebuilt but must be earned, that the most important relationships are often with people who share your daily struggles rather than your bank account balance. On Clara's 50th birthday, the entire extended family, biological and chosen, gathered at the original Sunshine Daycare for a celebration that spilled from inside the building to the playground and parking lot. Children who had graduated from the program returned with their parents to honor the woman who had cared for them during their earliest years. Former parents brought homemade dishes representing the diversity of the community Clara served. City council members came to acknowledge her contributions to early childhood education. But the moment Clara treasured most came when Emily and Max presented her with a scrapbook they'd been secretly creating for months. Every page contained photos, drawings, and written memories from people whose lives had been touched by Clara's care. There were pictures of Clara braiding hair, reading stories, pushing swings, dispensing Band-Aids, and encouragement in equal measure. There were notes from parents thanking her for loving their children during long work days, from teenagers remembering how safe she'd made them feel as preschoolers, from fellow teachers celebrating her wisdom and leadership. The final page contained a letter signed by all 3 Whitmans, Andrew, Emily, and Max, officially welcoming Clara into their family, not as an employee or even as a friend, but as someone we choose to love forever, someone whose presence makes us better people, someone who taught us that real wealth comes from the relationships we build and maintain with integrity and devotion. As the celebration continued around them, Andrew found himself sitting beside Clara on the front steps of the daycare center, watching Emily teach a group of younger children how to play a clapping game, while Max helped distribute birthday cake with the seriousness of someone entrusted with an important mission. The late afternoon sun cast everything in golden light, and the sounds of children laughing, mixed with conversations in multiple languages, created a symphony of community and belonging. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't found the necklace?" Andrew asked. It was a question that had haunted him during the darkest moments of self-reflection over the past 2 years. Clara considered this thoughtfully, as she considered most things. "I think truth finds a way to surface eventually," she said. Maybe not the literal truth about the necklace, but the deeper truth about what really matters. Emily and Max would have grown up knowing something was wrong with how I was treated. They would have carried questions about justice and family and loyalty. Maybe they would have found me when they got older. Maybe they would have spent their childhoods learning to trust their own moral compass instead of accepting adult decisions they knew were wrong. She paused, watching Emily demonstrate patience with a frustrated 4-year-old who couldn't master the clapping rhythm. Maybe the real miracle isn't that you found me again, but that your children never stopped believing I belonged in your family. They held space for me even when the adults had given up. Andrew felt the familiar tightness in his throat that came whenever Clara's wisdom revealed the depth of his earlier failures. But mixed with the regret was profound gratitude for Clara's forgiveness, for his children's moral clarity, for the chance to rebuild relationships on a foundation of mutual respect rather than economic necessity. "What would you tell other women in situations like yours?" he asked. "Women who are caring for other people's families, who might be overlooked or undervalued or vulnerable to false accusations." Clara's expression grew thoughtful, and when she spoke, her voice carried the strength of someone who had survived betrayal and chosen grace over bitterness. "I'd tell them to document everything, not because they don't trust the families they work for, but because trust and verification aren't opposites. I'd tell them to maintain their own friendships, their own interests, their own sense of identity outside of the families they serve. I'd tell them that love and respect aren't the same thing, and they deserve both." She gestured toward the playground, where children from dozens of different families were playing together under the watchful eyes of parents and caregivers who had built their own support network through the daycare community. "Most importantly, I'd tell them that their worth isn't determined by whether one family recognizes it or not. There are always children who need love, always communities that need care, always ways to make a meaningful difference in the world. Sometimes losing one opportunity opens the door to something better, something more aligned with your values and your gifts." As the evening wound down and families began to pack up leftover food and gather tired children, Emily approached Clara with a question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. "Clara," she said, "when I grow up, will you help me learn how to take care of children the right way, like you do?" Clara's smile lit up her entire face. "Sweetheart, you already know how. You're patient with younger kids. You notice when someone feels left out. You share what you have. You learned these things by watching and practicing, just like I did when I was young. But I want to make sure I never treat anyone the way we treated you," Emily said with the stark honesty that sometimes made adults uncomfortable. "I want to make sure that if someone takes care of my family, I always remember to say thank you and treat them like family too." Andrew drew in a sharp breath, unprepared for his daughter's direct acknowledgement of their past failures and her determination to do better. Clara knelt to Emily's level, taking the child's hands in her own weathered ones. "That intention, that awareness, that commitment to treating people with dignity, honey, that's exactly how change happens. One person at a time, one family at a time, one generation, learning to do better than the one before." As they walked to their respective cars, Andrew pushing Max on his shoulders while Emily skipped beside them, Clara felt the deep satisfaction of a life that had found its proper shape. Not the shape she had originally planned, not the shape that others had tried to force upon her, but the shape that emerged when loss was transformed into purpose, when betrayal became the catalyst for building something better. The lights of Manhattan glittered in the distance, representing wealth and power and opportunity. But the real richness surrounded her here, in the laughter of children who felt safe in her care, in the respect of a community that valued her contributions, in the love of a family that had learned to see her clearly and choose her daily. The months that followed brought new challenges and deeper healing. Clara had been invited to speak at a national conference on child care worker rights, where she would share her story not as a victim, but as an advocate for systemic change in how domestic workers are treated. The invitation had come through Dr. Patricia Williams, a researcher at Columbia University who had heard about the Sunshine Daycare model and wanted to document how trauma could be transformed into community action. "Your experience," Dr. Williams explained during their initial meeting, "speaks to something much larger than one family's mistake. It's about the vulnerability of workers who care for other people's families, the assumptions made based on class and race, the way we value some kinds of work over others." Clara had hesitated at first, uncomfortable with the idea of public exposure. But Emily, now 11 and increasingly passionate about social justice, had encouraged her adoptive grandmother, as she'd begun calling Clara, to share her story. "Think about all the other Claras out there," Emily had said with startling maturity. "Think about the women who don't have anyone to speak up for them like we spoke up for you." The speech Clara delivered in Washington, D.C. was later published in academic journals and shared widely on social media. She spoke with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout her ordeal. But her words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. When we hire someone to care for our most precious possessions, our children, we must ask ourselves what kind of relationship we're creating. Are we building partnerships based on mutual respect, or are we maintaining hierarchies that make some people expendable? Are we creating families or simply managing employees? The answer to that question determines not just the quality of care our children receive, but the kind of human beings they become. The response was overwhelming. Clara received hundreds of emails from domestic workers sharing their own stories, from employers asking for guidance on creating more equitable relationships, from researchers wanting to study the Sunshine Daycare model. A documentary filmmaker reached out about creating a full-length film about Clara's journey, and several publishers inquired about book deals. But Clara remained grounded in her daily work, still arriving at the daycare center each morning to greet children and parents, still knowing instinctively when a toddler needed extra comfort or a parent needed a sympathetic ear. The most profound changes, however, were happening within the Whitman family itself. Andrew had begun using his business connections to advocate for better treatment of domestic workers, incorporating fair wage policies and comprehensive benefits into his own companies, and encouraging other executives to do the same. He'd joined the board of a nonprofit organization working to reform labor laws for household employees, bringing his financial expertise and credibility to support policy changes that could protect workers like Clara. Margaret, after years of resistance, had finally begun attending therapy to address her own issues with class, privilege, and the casual cruelty she'd inflicted on someone whose only crime was loving her children well. The process was painful and slow, but it resulted in a genuine apology to Clara, not the institutional lawyer-drafted kind that protected reputations, but a raw, honest acknowledgement of harm done and healing needed. "I was raised to believe that staff were different from family," Margaret had told Clara during one of their difficult conversations. "I thought keeping boundaries was protecting my children from being hurt if you left. I never considered that treating you as disposable was teaching them that love is conditional, that some people matter less than others. I'm ashamed of what I modeled for them and grateful beyond words that you loved them enough to show them a better way." Emily and Max had thrived in the environment Clara had helped create at the daycare center. Both children were fluent in Spanish now, having absorbed the language through daily exposure to their extended community family. They moved easily between worlds, equally comfortable at charity galas and neighborhood block parties, in boardrooms and playground conferences. They had developed what educators call cultural competence, but more importantly, they had developed what Clara called moral courage, the ability to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult or unpopular. Max, now 8, had organized a fundraiser at his elite private school to support the daycare center, explaining to his classmates that some kids' parents have to work and they need a place that loves them like Clara loves us. His presentation, which included photos of the center and testimonials from families it served, had resulted in a significant donation and several parent volunteers. Emily, 12 and increasingly articulate about social issues, had started a mentorship program pairing older children from the daycare with teenagers from her school. She had also written a series of articles for her school newspaper about economic inequality and the hidden workforce that supported wealthy families. Her teachers were amazed by her empathy and analytical thinking, not realizing they were witnessing the fruits of Clara's quiet lessons about justice, compassion, and the dignity of all work. The Whitman penthouse itself had been transformed over the years. The staff quarters where Clara had lived for 9 years had been renovated into a proper guest suite with its own entrance, full bathroom, and sitting area. Clara didn't live there anymore. She'd purchased her own small apartment in Queens, furnished with pieces that reflected her taste rather than her employer's, but the space was always available for her use. More importantly, the suite served as a symbol of changed attitudes. Domestic workers were no longer housed like grateful supplicants in cramped quarters, but welcomed as valued family members with space and privacy. The kitchen, once Clara's domain alone, had become a gathering place where Andrew learned to cook alongside Clara on weekends, where Emily practiced the Dominican recipes she had learned from her friend Isabella's mother, where Max conducted elaborate cooking experiments that usually resulted in delicious disasters. Family photos now included Clara prominently, not in the background as help, but in the center as the matriarch she'd always been in everything but title. The formal dining room, previously reserved for entertaining business associates and social climbers, now hosted the monthly community dinners that had become legendary in their neighborhood. These gatherings brought together daycare parents, fellow teachers, community activists, and the growing network of people who orbited around Clara's influence. Conversations flowed between English and Spanish, between discussions of child development theory and practical parenting challenges, between stories of immigration and dreams for the next generation. Andrew found these dinners more intellectually stimulating than any corporate board meeting, more emotionally satisfying than any business triumph. He discovered that listening to Maria, the night janitor who was putting her daughter through college, or Carlos, the construction worker who coached Little League on weekends, expanded his understanding of success, resilience, and the American dream in ways his Harvard MBA never had. Margaret, when she was present, contributed by funding need-based scholarships for daycare families and quietly paying off medical bills for community members facing health crises, gestures that didn't erase her past behavior but demonstrated genuine commitment to repair. As Clara approached her 52nd birthday, she found herself reflecting on the unexpected shape her life had taken. From the grief of losing Sophia to the devastation of false accusations to the joy of rebuilding relationships on honest foundations, each chapter had led to the next in ways she couldn't have planned or predicted. The little girl who died too young had given Clara the capacity to love other people's children with fierce devotion. The injustice she'd experienced had motivated her to advocate for vulnerable workers. The family who'd betrayed her trust had ultimately become the family who taught her that forgiveness and accountability could coexist. She kept Sophia's photograph on her desk at the daycare center, next to pictures of Emily and Max and the hundreds of other children who had passed through her care over the years. Sometimes parents would ask about the little girl in the faded snapshot, and Clara would share Sophia's story, not as a tragedy that defined her, but as a love that continued to multiply through all the children she'd been privileged to nurture. She would have been 23 now, Clara told Dr. Williams during one of their follow-up interviews for the ongoing research project. Sometimes I wonder what kind of woman she would have become, what she would have contributed to the world. But then I look around here and I see her influence everywhere. In my patience with a difficult child, in my understanding of a parent's fear during a medical crisis, in my certainty that every child deserves to feel cherished. She made me a better caregiver. Her love lives on in every hug I give, every tear I dry, every moment I help a child feel safe. The documentary about Clara's journey had been completed and was making the rounds at film festivals, winning awards and sparking discussions about domestic worker rights, racial justice, and the invisible labor that supports American families. Clara had been invited to screen it at several universities, always emphasizing that her story was not unique, that there were thousands of women like her, caring for other people's families with skill and devotion while remaining vulnerable to dismissal, false accusations, and economic insecurity. The most meaningful recognition, however, came from an unexpected source. The Association of Professional Nannies had created the Clara Martinez Award for Excellence in Child Care, given annually to domestic workers who demonstrated not just skill in their work, but leadership in advocating for their profession and community. The first recipient was a woman from Los Angeles who had organized a support network for undocumented nannies, providing them with resources for legal aid, English classes, and emotional support. This award, Clara said during the presentation ceremony, honors something I learned the hard way, that individual excellence means nothing if it doesn't lift up the community. None of us succeed alone, and none of us should face adversity alone. When we support each other, we change not just our own lives, but the lives of every family we serve. Emily and Max attended the ceremony, now teenagers who spoke with sophistication about labor rights, economic justice, and the value of care work. Emily, 16, was planning to study early childhood education in college, but with a focus on policy and advocacy rather than traditional teaching. She wanted to work on legislation that would provide better protections and benefits for domestic workers, drawing on everything she'd learned from watching Clara navigate professional challenges and triumphs. Max, 14, had started a non-profit organization run entirely by teenagers that provided weekend programming for lower-income families, offering everything from financial literacy classes to SAT prep to college application assistance. His inspiration, he told reporters, came from watching how Clara had expanded her own influence beyond individual child care to community development. Both children spoke fluent Spanish, having spent summers volunteering at the daycare center's sister location in the Bronx, where they worked alongside teenagers from very different backgrounds, but shared a commitment to social justice that Clara had modeled throughout their childhood. They moved easily between their privileged upbringing and their community service, understanding viscerally that their advantages came with responsibilities to lift others up. Andrew's transformation had been perhaps the most dramatic of all the family members. The ruthlessly efficient businessman who had once measured success solely in profit margins now spent significant portions of his time mentoring other high-net-worth individuals on sustainable philanthropy and equitable employment practices. He'd become a frequent speaker at conferences on corporate social responsibility, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the costs of prioritizing assumptions over relationships. "I was incredibly wealthy but emotionally impoverished," he would tell audiences of fellow executives. "I had everything money could buy, but nothing money couldn't destroy. It took losing the most important person in my family for me to understand the difference between having employees and building relationships, between managing staff and creating community." His business had restructured its compensation models to include profit sharing for all employees, comprehensive health care that covered families, and educational benefits that extended to workers' children. He had implemented a policy of promoting from within whenever possible and requiring unconscious bias training for all managers. The changes had initially concerned some investors, but productivity, retention, and innovation had all improved significantly, making Andrew's company a case study in how social responsibility could enhance rather than undermine profitability. Most importantly, Andrew had learned to be present for his children in ways that went far beyond financial provision. He attended every school event, knew the names of their friends, and engaged in real conversations about their hopes, fears, and developing worldviews. But perhaps more significantly, he had learned to show affection, the hugs, kisses, verbal expressions of love and quality time that Clara had always provided naturally, but he had withheld out of emotional incompetence rather than malice. "Daddy," Max had said one evening as Andrew tucked him into bed, "I used to think rich people were like robots because you never seemed to feel anything. But now I know you feel everything. You just didn't know how to show it." The observation, delivered with the casual honesty of adolescence, had moved Andrew to tears, the kind of tears he'd learned to shed without shame, having discovered that emotional vulnerability was a strength rather than a weakness. The daycare center had grown into a model that was being replicated across the country. Clara now spent part of her time consulting with other communities that wanted to create similar programs, always emphasizing that successful child care required deep understanding of local culture, economic realities, and family structures. She'd co-authored several academic papers on culturally responsive early childhood education and had been invited to speak at international conferences on innovative approaches to community-based care. But her favorite part of the work remained the daily interactions with children and families at the original Sunshine location. She still read stories to circles of 3-year-olds, still knew which children needed extra hugs and which needed gentle challenges, still could calm a crying toddler with the same patient presence she'd brought to Emily and Max all those years ago. The waiting list for enrollment had grown long, but Clara had resisted suggestions to expand too quickly, understanding that quality care required manageable ratios and deep relationships that couldn't be scaled without losing their essential character. Instead, she'd focused on training other directors who could replicate the model authentically, always emphasizing that technique without genuine care was ineffective and that love without professional skill could be dangerous. "Children know the difference," she would tell new teachers. "They can sense when someone is going through the motions versus when someone truly sees them, values them, delights in them. Our job is to make every child feel like they matter, like they're safe, like they belong. Everything else flows from that foundation." The staff Clara had developed was diverse in background, but united in commitment to these principles. Many were women who had faced their own challenges with employment discrimination, immigration status, or economic insecurity. Women who understood viscerally why jobs like theirs needed to come with dignity, fair wages, and opportunities for professional growth. The center had become known for providing career advancement pathways, helping teachers earn additional certifications, supporting education goals, and promoting qualified staff to leadership positions. Clara's own apartment had become a gathering place for this extended professional family. Sunday dinners rotated between the daycare community room and Clara's living room, depending on weather and numbers. Her small space would fill with teachers, parents, community activists, and whoever else needed a meal and comfortable conversation. Emily and Max were regular attendees, bringing homework to finish at Clara's kitchen table while she cooked and dispensed advice in equal measure. These gatherings had become so popular that Clara had started hosting Clara's Kitchen Sessions twice monthly, where community members could bring their concerns, celebrate their victories, and problem-solve together over home-cooked food and strong coffee. Local politicians had started attending these informal meetings, recognizing that Clara's Kitchen had become an important pulse point of community needs and priorities. When the city council was considering cuts to early childhood education funding, 30 people who regularly gathered at Clara's apartment showed up at the hearing to speak in opposition. When a new bus route was proposed that would better serve working families, the same group researched and advocated for the change. Clara had become, without seeking it, a community leader whose influence extended far beyond childcare into housing, transportation, healthcare, and education policy. "I never intended to become political," she told a reporter who was profiling community activists. "I just intended to take care of children. But you can't do that work well without understanding the systems that support or undermine families. You can't love children fully without advocating for the conditions they need to thrive." Sometimes caring for people means changing the world that surrounds them. The ripple effects of Clara's influence continued to expand in unexpected directions. Dr. Williams had published a book based on her research that featured Clara's story prominently, and it had become required reading in social work and early childhood education programs across the country. The documentary had been picked up by a streaming service and watched by millions of people, generating discussions about domestic worker rights in living rooms, classrooms, and policy circles previously untouched by these conversations. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the hundreds of children who had passed through Clara's care over the years. Many were now teenagers or young adults who credited their success to the foundation of security and love they'd received during their earliest years. They wrote to Clara regularly, sharing news of academic achievements, athletic victories, college acceptances, and first job offers. They brought their own children to meet the woman who had shaped their earliest understanding of what caring looked like. "Miss Clara taught me that I mattered," wrote Carmen, now a freshman at Columbia University studying to become a doctor. "Even when I was 3 years old and didn't speak much English, she made me feel smart and valued and capable. She saw potential in me before I knew I had any. Now when I meet patients who feel invisible or overlooked, I try to give them what she gave me, the feeling that someone sees them clearly and believes in their worth." These letters were Clara's greatest treasures, more valuable than any award or recognition. They represented the multiplication of love across generations, the way one person's commitment to nurturing could echo forward through decades of influence. She kept them in a special box in her bedroom, reading them when she needed reminding of why her work mattered, why the difficult days were worth enduring, why choosing to rebuild rather than retreat had been the right decision. At 65, Clara had begun thinking about retirement, though the concept seemed almost meaningless when your work had become so integral to your identity and community. Emily, now a senior in college majoring in social work with a focus on child and family services, had expressed interest in eventually taking over the daycare center's operations. She'd spent every summer since turning 16 working there, learning not just about early childhood education, but about community organizing, nonprofit management, and the delicate balance of providing services while advocating for systemic change. "I want to continue what you started," Emily told Clara during one of their regular planning conversations, "but I also want to expand it in new directions. I'm thinking about adding services for undocumented families, creating legal aid partnerships, maybe even developing affordable housing connected to childcare. I want to build on your foundation, but address some of the bigger structural issues that make families vulnerable." Clara smiled at this ambitious vision, recognizing in Emily the same passion for justice that had sustained her through her own challenges. But she also saw something she'd never had as a young woman: connections, resources, confidence born of privilege used in service of others rather than self-aggrandizement. "Just remember," Clara cautioned gently, "that programs are only as good as the relationships they're built on. You can't love people through systems and policies alone. The individual connections, the daily presence, the knowledge of each family's specific needs and dreams, that's what makes the difference." Max had chosen a different path, but one equally influenced by Clara's example. He was studying business and economics at NYU, planning to work in sustainable development and fair trade enterprises that could provide economic opportunities in communities like the one that had supported Clara through her most difficult period. His senior thesis was analyzing the economic impact of high-quality childcare on community development, using the Sunshine Daycare system as a primary case study. "Clara showed me that business can be a tool for social good," Max explained to his advisor. "My dad made money by extracting value from systems. I want to make money by creating value for communities, by building enterprises that lift everyone up instead of concentrating wealth at the top." Both Emily and Max had internalized lessons about power, privilege, and responsibility that would have been impossible to learn through lectures or books alone. They'd lived through the consequences of their parents' mistakes and the rewards of choosing repair over defensiveness, community over isolation. They understood viscerally that their advantages came with obligations to use their resources, education, and networks in service of people who'd had fewer opportunities. Andrew watched his children's development with a mixture of pride and wonder, recognizing that Clara's influence had shaped them in ways his money never could have. They were confident without being arrogant, ambitious without being selfish, comfortable with their privilege while remaining conscious of its responsibilities. Most importantly, they had learned to see clearly, to recognize value in people regardless of their economic status, to understand that intelligence and wisdom took many forms, to appreciate the dignity of all honest work. The final phase of Clara's career had brought international recognition. She'd been invited to speak at United Nations conferences on early childhood development, sharing the podium with ministers of education and development experts from around the world. Her message was always the same, that investing in the people who care for young children was investing in the future of entire societies, that supporting caregivers wasn't charity but strategic necessity for any community that wanted to thrive. She'd visited programs in Sweden where child care workers were certified professionals with university degrees and salaries commensurate with their importance. She'd consulted with organizations in Mexico developing rural child care programs that honored indigenous parenting traditions while meeting modern development needs. She'd worked with researchers in Kenya studying how community-based care could support families affected by HIV/AIDS. Each experience had deepened her understanding of how universal the needs were, for children to feel safe and valued, for parents to have trusted support while working, for caregivers to be respected and compensated fairly for work that required both skill and heart. When I first arrived in New York, Clara reflected during a speech at Columbia University, I thought my goal was to find one family to serve well, to earn enough money to survive, maybe to send some savings back to Alabama. I never imagined I would see Stockholm, Mexico City, Nairobi. I never imagined I would speak to audiences of policymakers about theories and research. But I've learned that when you commit to loving people well, to seeing clearly and responding with both compassion and courage, the world opens up in ways you never expected. The audience, a mixture of graduate students, faculty, and community advocates, gave her a standing ovation that lasted several minutes, but Clara's attention was focused on a young woman in the front row who was crying. After the formal presentation, the woman approached with a story that had become familiar to Clara over the years. She was a nanny from the Philippines working for a wealthy family in Connecticut, sending most of her earnings home to support her own children's education, struggling with loneliness and the constant tension between love for her charges and resentment at being treated as invisible by their parents. "How do you maintain hope?" the woman asked. "How do you keep caring when people don't see your worth?" Clara had answered this question hundreds of times, but she always responded as if hearing it for the first time, because she knew that for the person asking, it was the first time, and the answer could determine whether someone stayed trapped in bitterness or found a path forward. You maintain hope by remembering that your worth isn't determined by other people's recognition, Clara said, taking the woman's hands in her own. You have value because you exist, because you love, because you show up every day to care for people who need you. Their blindness is their limitation, not your failure. She paused, seeing Sophia in this young woman's face, seeing herself 3 decades ago, seeing all the women who had loved other people's children while their own hearts ached with longing and loneliness. But more than that, Clara continued, you maintain hope by building community with people who do see you clearly. Find other caregivers, other women who understand your experience. Share resources, share stories, share the burden of feeling invisible. When you're seen clearly by even one person, you remember who you really are. The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour, with other attendees joining to share their own experiences and offer practical support. Exchange of phone numbers, offers of friendship, invitations to gatherings where this young woman would not be the only one navigating the complex emotions of professional caregiving. Clara watched these connections form with the same satisfaction she'd felt years earlier watching children learn to share toys or include new playmates in their games. Community building, she'd learned, was just an adult version of the social skills she'd been teaching in childcare for decades. As Clara approached her 70th birthday, the Whitman family began planning a celebration that would honor not just her personal milestone, but the transformation she'd catalyzed in their lives and community. Emily, now a licensed social worker running a satellite daycare program in the Bronx, was coordinating with Max, who had returned to New York after completing his MBA, to launch a social enterprise fund focused on women-led businesses in immigrant communities. They wanted to create something that would reflect Clara's values: inclusive, multi-generational, focused on community rather than individual achievement. The celebration they organized took place over an entire weekend in multiple locations that had significance in Clara's journey. Friday evening was a formal dinner at the original Sunshine Daycare Center, with speeches from political leaders, academic colleagues, and former families who credited Clara with shaping their children's character. Saturday was a block party in Queens, with food trucks representing the dozen countries of origin of families Clara had served, live music from community musicians, and activities for children of all ages. Sunday was a quiet gathering in Clara's apartment, limited to close family and the women who had become her chosen sisters over the years of struggle and triumph. At each event, the same themes emerged in people's testimonials: Clara's ability to see potential in everyone, her capacity to love without condition while maintaining appropriate boundaries, her courage to speak truth to power when justice required it, and her wisdom in building community rather than simply serving individuals. Dr. Williams presented research findings showing that children who had attended Clara's programs scored higher on measures of empathy, academic achievement, and social skills than control groups, providing scientific validation of what everyone who knew Clara's work had observed anecdotally. The mayor presented Clara with a key to the city, acknowledging her contributions to early childhood development and community organizing. But the tribute that moved Clara most came from the teenagers and young adults who had been her first charges at the daycare center 20 years earlier. They had organized themselves, created a video montage of their current lives, and written a collective letter that one of them read aloud. "Dear Clara, we are doctors and teachers and social workers and artists and parents and activists because you believed in us before we believed in ourselves. You taught us that every child deserves to feel precious, that every family deserves respect, that every person has something valuable to contribute. You showed us what love in action looks like, and now we try to love others the way you loved us. Thank you for seeing us, for protecting us, for preparing us to change the world." The letter was signed by over 200 people, now spread across the country and around the world, united by their shared experience of Clara's care during their most formative years. As Clara listened to their voices, she could see Sophia's influence multiplying exponentially. One lost daughter whose love had taught her mother to nurture countless other children who would go on to nurture their own children and communities. The mathematics of love, Clara realized, defied conventional logic. Loss could be transformed into abundance, grief could become a source of healing, and one person's commitment to caring could ripple outward through generations in ways that could never be fully calculated or contained. On Sunday evening, as the formal celebrations concluded and only the most intimate friends remained in Clara's apartment, Emily presented her with one final gift: a scholarship fund that would provide full college tuition for children of domestic workers, funded by the Whitman Foundation, but administered by the daycare center according to Clara's values and criteria. "It's not enough," Emily said, "to honor your work with words. We want to create opportunities for the next generation of children whose parents do the invisible work that holds our society together. We want to break the cycle where caring for other people's families means sacrificing your own family's future." Clara sat quietly for a long moment, overwhelmed not just by the generosity of the gesture, but by what it represented: the completion of a circle that had begun with her own lost opportunities, her own daughter's truncated life, her own experience of being discarded and then reclaimed. Now, her pain had been transformed into pathway for others. Her losses had become the foundation for other families' gains. Sophia would be 51 now, Clara said finally, her voice soft but strong. She would probably be a grandmother herself, maybe doing this kind of work, maybe benefiting from this kind of support. I can't give her those opportunities anymore, but I can make sure other mothers don't have to choose between caring for their own children and caring for others. The room fell silent except for the gentle sounds of a summer evening in Queens, children playing in the courtyard below, music drifting from open windows, the distant hum of the city that had become home to all of them in different ways. Andrew, now in his 70s but still vigorous, cleared his throat with the nervous energy he still displayed when about to express emotions that didn't come naturally. "Clara," he said, "I need to tell you something I've never said clearly enough. You saved our family. Not just the children, though you certainly saved them. You saved Margaret and me from becoming people we couldn't respect, from living lives that were hollow despite being full of things. You taught us what wealth really means, what success actually looks like, what legacy truly matters." He paused, looking around the room at the faces of people who had become his chosen family through Clara's influence. Maria, still working, but now as a supervisor rather than night janitor. Dr. Williams, whose research had been shaped by Clara's insights. The teachers who had learned their craft under Clara's guidance. The parents whose children had thrived under her care. "I used to think," Andrew continued, "that the most important thing I could do was accumulate enough money to provide security for my family's future. But sitting here, looking around this room, I realized that the most important thing I ever did was recognize my mistake, apologize genuinely, and commit to doing better. Everything good in my life flows from that decision, and that decision was only possible because you were gracious enough to give me the chance to make it." Margaret, who had been mostly quiet during the weekend's festivities, spoke up from her corner chair where she'd been observing rather than participating in the conversation. "I owe you an apology that I've been too proud to make properly," she said, her voice carrying the careful control she'd perfected over decades of managing social expectations. "I treated you as a threat instead of a blessing because I was insecure about my own role as a mother, jealous of your natural connection with my children, afraid of looking bad by comparison to your competence and warmth." The admission hung in the air like a bridge being built over a chasm that had existed for decades. Margaret rarely spoke with such vulnerability, but Clara's birthday celebration had created a space where old truths could be acknowledged and possibly resolved. "I convinced myself that maintaining distance was protecting the family structure," Margaret continued, "but what I was really protecting was my own ego, my own sense of importance in a household where everyone else seemed to gravitate toward your warmth instead of my authority." Clara listened without judgment, recognizing the courage it took for Margaret to acknowledge these painful realities, especially in front of the community that had become Clara's chosen family. "I made you pay the price for my insecurities," Margaret said, tears finally breaking through her composed facade. "I destroyed your life temporarily, damaged your reputation, put you through months of financial and emotional hardship because I couldn't admit that you were better at something I thought I should naturally excel at. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know that I understand what I did, and I'm ashamed of the person I was." The room held its collective breath, waiting to see how Clara would respond to this long overdue acknowledgement. Clara sat quietly for several minutes, not because she was deciding what to say, but because she was gathering the strength to say what she'd already decided years ago. "Margaret," she said finally, "I forgave you a long time ago. Not because what you did was acceptable, but because carrying anger was hurting me more than it was hurting you. Forgiveness isn't about pretending harm didn't happen or excusing destructive behavior. It's about refusing to let someone else's mistakes define your own life." She stood and moved to Margaret's chair, bending down to take her hands. "But more than that, I want you to know that I understand what it's like to feel insecure about your parenting, to worry that you're not enough for your children, to feel jealous of people who seem to manage family life more easily than you do. Those feelings are normal. What matters is what you do with them. The physical contact between the two women, the embrace that followed Clara's words, represented healing that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier. It wasn't a return to the previous relationship, because that relationship had been built on inequality and false assumptions. Instead, it was the beginning of an adult connection based on mutual acceptance of their flawed humanity and shared love for Emily and Max. As the evening wound down and people began making their departures, Clara found herself standing in her small kitchen with Emily and Max, cleaning dishes and reflecting on the weekend's events. These routines had been at the heart of their relationship from the beginning, not grand gestures or expensive gifts, but the daily rhythms of care that created security and connection. "Are you happy?" Emily asked, a question that might have seemed simple, but one that carried the weight of everything they'd been through together. "With your life, with how everything turned out, with the choices you made?" Clara considered the question seriously. Understanding that Emily was really asking whether the pain had been worth it, whether choosing repair over withdrawal had been the right decision, whether love could truly triumph over betrayal and loss. "I'm content," Clara said finally. "Content is better than happy because it doesn't depend on circumstances staying the same. I'm at peace with the life I've built, with the choices I've made, with the community we've created together. I'm grateful for the pain because it taught me things I needed to know. I'm grateful for the joy because it sustained me through the difficult parts. I'm grateful for all of it because it brought us to this moment." Max, now 22 and preparing to launch his social enterprise fund, wrapped his arms around Clara from behind in a hug that transported her back to his 5-year-old self, clinging to her apron while she cooked dinner. "You know what I learned from everything we went through," he said. "I learned that family isn't automatic. It's a choice you make every day. And I choose you every day, Clara. I choose to be your family because you chose to be ours, even when we gave you every reason not to." Emily nodded in agreement, her own arms joining the group embrace. "And I learned," she said, "that real wealth has nothing to do with money and bank accounts and everything to do with people who show up for each other consistently, who tell the truth even when it's hard, who forgive each other's mistakes and help each other do better. By that measure, we're the richest family in New York." As they stood together in Clara's modest kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived, photographs of children grown into adults, letters of gratitude from families around the world, small mementos from a career spent nurturing others, Clara felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a purpose fulfilled, a calling honored, a love multiplied beyond what seemed possible. And you, have you ever poured your heart into caring for people who forgot to value you? Have you ever felt invisible in a household where your presence held everything together? Have you ever been blamed for something you didn't do? Had your integrity questioned by people who should have trusted you? Maybe you're reading this while children sleep nearby, children you've raised with more patience than their own parents sometimes show. Maybe you're thinking about families you've served who moved on without acknowledgement, birthday parties you organized but weren't invited to attend, graduations you made possible but watched from behind the scenes. If so, I want you to know that Clara's story is your story too. Your quiet strength, your daily sacrifices, your ability to love without guarantee of recognition. These qualities build the foundations that hold families together long after the money is spent and the fancy things are forgotten. Your worth isn't determined by whether one employer appreciates you. Your value isn't diminished by being overlooked or underestimated. The children you've nurtured carry pieces of your wisdom with them always. The families you've served are shaped by your influence, whether they acknowledge it or not. And somewhere, in ways you may never fully know, your love has changed the trajectory of lives that needed exactly what you had to offer. The woman reading this in Manila Sending money home to children you see twice a year while caring for other people's children every day, your sacrifice matters. The abuela in Los Angeles, raising grandchildren while their parents work multiple jobs to survive, your devotion is seen and valued. The young mother in Atlanta, cleaning houses while studying nursing at night, dreaming of better opportunities for your family. Your determination inspires everyone around you. You are the invisible foundation that supports the visible success of others. You are the steady heartbeat that keeps families functioning when everything else falls apart. You are the bridge between what is and what could be, showing children what unconditional love looks like even when their own parents are too busy, too stressed, too damaged to provide it consistently. Your hands that braid hair and wipe tears and prepare food and fold laundry with care. Those hands are healing the world one child at a time, one family at a time, one act of service at a time. Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and your experiences matter more than you know. Share how you found dignity in work that others might undervalue, how you've created community among people who understand your struggles, how you've maintained hope when recognition seemed impossible. If Clara's journey touched something in your heart, please leave a like and subscribe so this story reaches another woman who needs to be reminded of her worth, another family who needs to understand the true value of the caregivers in their lives. For more stories that honor the quiet heroes among us, click the link to access our special collection of narratives that celebrate resilience, forgiveness, and the transformative power of love that refuses to give up. Thank you for walking this path of recognition and healing with us. Until our next story, remember that you are seen, you are valued, and your love makes a difference that echoes through generations, changing the world in ways that can never be fully measured, but will never be forgotten.